Question number 23 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 3. Which statement best captures Ken Dial's central assumption in setting up his research? So this is a very particular pointed question. Realize that question 23 is related to 24. 24 is the quote support for 23. So the question is asking which best captures Ken Dial's central assumption in setting up his research. So we need to talk about a very particular moment. When Ken Dial sets up his research, what is his central assumption? This is a very important part of the story because this is before he does his experiment. This is all about his central assumption. What does he assume before he sets it up? So, A, the acquisition of flight in young birds sheds light on the acquisition of flight in their evolutionary ancestors. Maybe. Because isn't his central assumption, if we remember his progression of thought in the story, he says that they jumped up like popcorn, describing how they would flap their half-formed wings and take short hop in the air. So when a group of graduate students challenged him, he designed a project to see what clues might lie in how baby game birds learn to fly. So his central assumption is, I observe that baby birds flap up like popcorn behind their parents. I wonder if that is how birds from evolutionarily learn to fly. That they were jumping from the ground and trying to, again, the ground up theory. So using the observation of how baby birds act in order to try to understand, evolutionarily speaking, how birds developed the ability to fly. So I like that. I actually like this answer, even though it's very dense. What's the central assumption? This is certainly that part was before his experiment. The acquisition of flight in young birds shed light on acquisition of flight in the evolutionary ancestors. If we can observe young birds, we can observe then maybe a glimpse into the past of how birds historically learned to fly. Complex, dense answer, but it hits on all the points that make sense in the question. So what's a central assumption in setting up the research? The tendency of certain young birds to jump erratically is a somewhat recent evolved behavior. Okay, just because they're jumping up erratically, is this a recent evolved behavior, or does he somehow make it like, this is a very recent evolutionary trait. I've never seen this before. Like, there's no reason for us to think that this is a recent behavior of birds. This one word, recent evolutionary behavior, makes, I think, the answer to be incorrect. What about C? What's a central assumption in setting up his research? Young birds in a controlled research setting are less likely than birds in the wild to require perches when at rest. Is this a central assumption of his before he sets up his experiment? Young birds in a controlled research setting are less likely to require perches? No, if anything, young birds in a controlled setting are more likely to require perches. But I don't think he ever, forget about that. I don't think he ever made a distinction of saying before he started this experiment, like, oh, my assumption is that birds in a controlled setting are less likely to require perches. He didn't even know that they needed perches. So forget about this assumption about what's an assumption in setting up his research, that they need perches or they don't need perches. He didn't even know that perches were a factor. So C is almost like after the fact, looking at what he did and how he maybe messed up and was misguided, how he corrected his error and saying, well, that was an assumption. He never made that assumption because he made the error. What about D? What best captures Ken Dial's central assumption in setting up his research? Ground-dwelling and tree-climbing predecessors to birds evolved in parallel. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know. The assumption is not they evolved parallel together. That's almost like what the conclusion is of this piece. The conclusion is it might have been a bit of both. Maybe some birds flew, ground up and some of them flew tree down. But that's not a central assumption that he's making. He's not saying, I believe that they evolved in parallel, therefore let me continue with my experiment. So I don't like that. Just like I don't like C, where it's like he's not saying this before the experiment. He's not saying, like D, it's like, oh, I think that they occurred in parallel, which would be a weird thing to, unless he has data to support it. He probably thinks that it's ground up only, based on the fact that he's looking at these birds and he's seeing the babies go ground up. What about C? Again, the same reason with C why I don't like it. Young birds in a controlled are less likely than birds in the wild require perches. He never makes that distinction early on of saying like, well, these birds require perches, but these don't. There's no assumption about perches. I think the answer to number 23 is going to be A. The acquisition of flight in young birds sheds light on the acquisition of flight in their evolutionary ancestors. If we look at young birds now, we can understand how birds in the past evolved. That's exactly what his assumption is, which is why he's setting up this experiment for young birds. I think the answer to 23 is going to be A, but just to be sure, let's look at the quotes for 24. Question number 24 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 3. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? So the previous question was asking, which statement best captures Ken Dial's central assumption in setting up his research? So this is a very particular question. Before Ken Dial, set up his research, what was his main assumption? And we think the answer is going to be A. His assumption was, looking at young birds jumping up like popcorn behind their parents, taking half-formed short hops in the air, that when he looked at that, he saw and came up with, oh, maybe this ability of young birds to develop flying will help us understand the evolutionary trajectory of how birds learn to fly. That's his assumption. But let's assume that we don't know the answer to 23. Let's just only answer a very particular question, which is, what statement best captures Ken Dial's central assumption in setting up his research? So before he set up his experiment, what's his central assumption? We need to find a quote that answers his central assumption. So let's look at 1 to 4. Is this his central assumption before he set up his research? At field sites around the world, Ken Dial saw a pattern in how young pheasants, quails, tinamous, and other ground birds ran along behind their parents. I feel like we're getting warmer. That doesn't say a central assumption. It's like his central assumption was that he saw something. It's like, okay, what did he see? And what was that assumption? And what was it that led him to believe a certain thing when he set up his experiment? Let's continue with B, 6 to 11. Does 6 to 11 talk about what Ken Dial's assumption was in setting up his research? So when a group of graduate students challenged him to come up with new data on the age-old ground-up tree-down debate, he designed a project to see what clues might lie in how baby game birds learn to fly. So this is a nice quote, because this is talking about a connection between how baby game birds learn to fly, connecting it with what's the debate, the tree-down, ground-up debate. How do early developmental characteristics in birds, how do they help us understand the ground-up, tree-down debate? I like that. And that matches up nicely with A, which is what we think our answer is to 23. Which statement best captures Ken Dial's central assumption? That understanding the flight of birds, as children, as baby game birds, helps us understand the evolutionary trajectory of evolution of flight. So I like that. I like how B talks about what is his central assumption. Well, his central assumption is talking about, he connects the observation of how young birds act, and he's connecting it with the tree down, ground up debate. So I like this. This quote talks about both those things. Let's take a look at C, 16 and 19. Does 16 and 19 talk about Ken Dial's central assumption before he set up his research? When the cowboy stopped by to see how things were going, Ken showed him his nice, tidy laboratory setup and explained how the bird's first hops and flights would be measured. Is there anything in there that leads us to believe that that was his central assumption in setting up the research? He set up a nice, tidy laboratory setup. If we read a little bit after, remember this is not part of the quote, but if we read a little bit after the quote, the rancher was incredulous. He took one look and said in pretty colorful language, "What are those birds doing on the ground?" So, does this capture a central assumption? This might match up with that answer choice with C for number 24, might match up with C for 23, because it's talking about, that's in proximity where he learns that birds like perches. They like to sit up. They don't like to, they don't like to just be on the ground. So, but we have to ask ourselves: is this the central assumption that he's making, that young birds are less likely than birds in the wild to require perches? He doesn't even know that perches are necessary. So he's not making an assumption of my central assumption rests on the belief that in a controlled setting, young birds are less likely to perch than wild birds to perch. That's his central assumption. He didn't even know that was a thing. So there's no way for him to assume that if he doesn't know it to be true. So that's why C is such a good bad answer for 24. Same with 23. I think that's a really deceptive pair. 24D, 23 to 24. So which statement best captures Ken Dial's central assumption in his research? At first it seemed unnatural. Ground birds don't like the ground. So this actually, if anything, proves why C and C for 23 and 24 can't be the answer because he's baffled that these ground birds don't like the ground. Maybe that might also be a good lure, D for 24, for C for 23. That it's like his assumption was turned upside down, but that wasn't an assumption on the outset. It's only he's thinking about it when someone brought it up. Maybe I'm spending too much time talking about why those answers are wrong, but I think it's important to understand because this is actually a very tricky, these types of science questions that they're very easily misled. It's very easy for someone to get misled by them. Is important to talk about in order to discuss the pitfalls so you don't make them. The only one that talks about his central assumption is the fact that early development of birds might lend knowledge to the scientific community to understand how birds evolved. So if we understand how young baby birds develop flight, we might be able to understand how birds developed flying. So that answer choice 24 is going to be B. That is the quote that connects the tree down ground up debate to development of early baby game bird flight. And that's going to match up obviously 23 with A. The acquisition of flight in young birds sheds light on the evolutionary path of their ancestors. Answer 23A, 24B.